possible or preposterous? Do you consider it possible that God broadcasts messages to us, but we fail to notice his messages because we do not tune in? Does each of us have the right equipment to hear him? Can we truly listen to God? Or would you characterize that statement as a preposterous proposition? Where can we find a credible source of information to begin investigating these questions? Why not start with the Holy Bible? I have no formal training in theology, but have enough faith to believe the answer does reside in the text, if we search for it. For example, in Sunday school, we've often taught the story of how God first spoke to Moses. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Exodus chapter 3, verses 2 through 4. God spoke directly to Moses, explaining his reasons for calling him, and then commanded him to act. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Exodus chapter 3, verses 9 through 10. Guided by God, Moses obeys and leads the Israelites out of Egypt. In the New Testament, the book of Acts describes a pivotal point in the development of the Christian church when God addresses Saul. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, he replied. Now get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you must do. Acts chapter 9, verses 3 through 6. Saul, the persecutor of Christians, becomes Paul, the leader of the new faith. He continues to speak to us today through his many letters to the early churches. It requires a measure of faith for us to believe all the details of these stories, particularly the report that both Moses and Paul heard God call their names and give personal instructions. Most Christians would probably agree that these events took place, as recorded in the Bible. However, many of us would need an immeasurable amount of faith to believe that God would speak directly to each one of us. Moses and Paul are central figures in the Bible, but the rest of us play the role of ordinary people. Why would God choose to speak to one of us? God has a mission plan for each one of us. Perhaps some of us need more guidance than others and need to hear specific instructions. On the other hand, if we believe that God has a specific directive for each of us, we might ask, why wouldn't he speak to all of us? Why would we assume that God stopped conversing with his people at the end of the Bible? Instead, we might consider that he will continue to communicate with us until his plan is completed. The Apostle Paul speaks with authority as one who experienced direct two-way communication with the Creator. He encourages us to seek to understand God's message and describes the roles of the Spirit in mediating the conversation. For who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the man's spirit within him? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. We have not received the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we may understand what God has freely given us. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 11 through 12. Maybe we believe in our hearts that God might speak directly to us, but avoid speaking openly of our belief, because we fear the negative perceptions associated with the claim of hearing God's voice or any voice in our minds. In an episode of American Idol, a television program in which thousands of people from across the United States vie to become the next singing superstar, one of the contestants claimed that God had sent her to the audition. To her astonishment, the judges turned her down. When the contestant insisted that she was qualified, one of the judges mockingly asked what God was telling her to do now. She claimed he was calling her to go on, singing in the audition. The judge stated emphatically that he believed God was telling her otherwise. Our current culture may refute the notion of individuals hearing from God directly, but does not renounce those who believe in a divine being. A 2006 Harris poll reported that 73% of adults surveyed in the United States believe God exists. And a Rasmussen report published in 2005 concluded that 47% of Americans say that they pray every day or nearly every day. One can observe a widespread respect for the act of prayer when a politician or other public figure professes to remember victims of a tragedy in his or her thoughts and prayers. No mainstream media source would criticize or ridicule a leader for that statement. By contrast, how many leaders or citizens would boldly declare that God responds verbally or otherwise to those prayers? The Harris poll also reported that only 29% of those surveyed believe that God controls what happens on earth. By inference, 50% of the surveyed audience believes God exists, but that he only exists to observe and does not intervene, a view consistent with the theological position of deism. Therefore, nearly 3/4 of the population disbelieves that God would speak to us, either because they don't believe in him at all, or because they believe in him but don't believe he intervenes. The remaining quarter of the people believe in a personal and active God who intervenes in our world, a view classified as theism. Currently, I would be more inclined to place my belief at one end of the spectrum or the other, either theism, the personal God, or atheism, believing he does not exist at all. The in-between choice, deism, seems to be a difficult position to support. How could such a powerful and loving being just sit back and never get involved? Yet, I can relate to those folks who believe he does not, because at an earlier point in my life, I was one of them. What do you believe? Has God ever communicated with you? Do you know anyone who claims to have heard God? Have you heard a trusted pastor or friend describe his or her experience in hearing the voice of God? If you have heard these claims, how have you responded? Do you believe these claims wholeheartedly, without a shred of doubt? Perhaps it's difficult to intellectually concede such a possibility, so you took a middle ground, accepting that your trusted person believes he or she heard this voice, or you assume that the person spoke in a figurative sense, while declaring in your own mind that it just can't be true. Conversely, perhaps you entirely rejected the concept, and at one time had even gone so far as to join a mocking chorus that attempted to discredit this type of testimony. I believe God makes use of many forms of communication to send us specific messages. For instance, have you experienced a coincidence or a convergence of events that had a probability so infinitesimal that you believe it had to be the intervention of God? Maybe it was a relatively minor event, such as bumping into a friend on the way to work who unknowingly gave you encouragement when you really needed it. Or maybe it was a situation more serious, such as missing a train or a plane due to some frustrating obstacle in your path, and finding out later that you somehow benefited from this delay. Some believers refer to these situations as God incidences, because the circumstances occur in a manner too well orchestrated to attribute to a mere coincidence. If you believe God would intervene in these type of situations, do you believe that God might also speak through someone else to you? If you believe he can control and orchestrate earthly events, then it must be well within his capability and will to direct someone to talk to you. Maybe the friend who gave you encouraging words just when you needed it was directed by God. Have we crossed the line beyond what you are willing to believe? If so, I don't blame you for doubting. Before you move on, please consider one or more questions about your experiences. Have you ever heard a voice guiding you to make a decision or take an action? Many of us would freely discuss the promptings of our inner voice, but few of us would admit that we hear God in our minds. How do we identify this inner voice that many of us speak about? Some would surmise that one part of the inner voice derives from the recalled memories of advice from parents, other family members, and friends. For example, when you were a small child, if you contemplated succumbing to the temptation to steal, hit, bite, or otherwise misbehave, did you hear your parents' voice in your head telling you not to? As an adult, do you still hear your mother or father reminding you to fasten your seatbelt when you get in the car? Regardless of whether we choose to obey or not, I believe most of us have heard that inner voice in situations where we know right from wrong and recognize prudence versus risk. Usually, we refer to that voice as our conscience. Yet, sometimes we experience an inner voice that advises us in a place where we have never been, and know that this could not have come from our earthly parents, but must have sprung from some other source. Maybe that inner voice represents a natural instinct, like the ability for animals to sense a tsunami and flee long before humans have sensed or discerned the oncoming disaster. When we tune in and hear this inner voice, do we attribute it to God or some other source? If we believe God created us, then we must believe the voice originates from God, since he created our minds. But the question remains whether we recognize all of his messages for us.